Your move, creep.
Sometimes it could be kind of easy to forget just how massive and wide-reaching the RoboCop IP actually is. Movies, TV procedurals, more than one animated series, a healthy amount of comic books, and even a theme park ride of sorts. And then, of course, since we were talking about RoboCop on this channel, multiple video game appearances. Oh, and let's not forget this amazing commercial that was released in the Korean market for RoboCop-endorsed fried chicken.
Oh, Rotte Hen fried chicken.
But even though this franchise has been around in some form or another since 1987, Robo's reputation has always been hit or miss. And what started off as a hyper-violent action movie satirizing corporate greed and the increasing militarization of American police forces around the country, eventually most of what made RoboCop such a biting critique when it was released, those features were sanded down when it became apparent that the cyborg could print money for MGM Studios and eventually Amazon once they acquired the company. But when it comes to that original 1987 movie, written by Michael Miner and Edward Neumeier, and directed by the legendary Paul Verhoeven, there are very few things like it. Through a series of corporate mergers and the failing metropolis of Detroit, the huge conglomerate OCP finds itself as the owner of the local police force, with the larger goal of eventually owning and rebuilding all of Detroit altogether. And with the corporation owning a little bit of everything, including arms manufacturers and robotic subsidiaries, OCP reaches the logical conclusion that it needs to overhaul its police force and make moves to remove as much of the human element as possible, citing the need for police officers who can work 24 hours in a day. And it is at this point where we meet Officer Alex Murphy, played by the charismatic Peter Weller, just as he has been reassigned to the unhinged Metro West precinct. This new job is in the hottest crime area of the city, the force here is underfunded, many cops here are ending up dead, and talks of the labor force starting a strike are gaining momentum. And wasting no time, Alex Murphy and his new partner Ann Lewis get their first call as a team before Murphy can even get settled in. And on a moment's notice, the officers find themselves in hot pursuit of the infamous Boddicker gang. And after a car chase and a shootout, Murphy and Lewis pursue on foot until they are forced to split up. And in this moment, the Boddicker gang gets the jump on Murphy, they beat him, and then they horrifically murder the officer in one of the goriest deaths of a main character that I've ever seen in a movie. And it's fucking awesome. But since OCP owned the police force and Murphy has signed away much of his autonomy in joining, OCP sets to work on implementing the RoboCop program. And what follows is one of the gnarliest bits of body horror ever depicted on screen, in which Murphy, barely clinging to life, has most of his humanity stripped of him while he is forced to watch as the majority of his body is replaced with machine parts and computers are implanted into his brain in order to make him both the ultimate piece of crime-fighting technology, but also as something of a tool and a slave to his corporate overlords. I mean, seriously, man. Murphy straight up got overkilled, but they still managed to get his ass back to work. And what follows from this resurrection scene is one of the best action movies ever made, as what is left of Murphy tries to grapple with his new body and programming. It's bombastic, it's hilarious, it's crass, and it is glorious. But if the RoboCop program and its implications weren't enough satire for you, the entire world that is presented to the viewer here is a complete hellscape. And the effects of late-stage capitalism are seen everywhere. Talking heads on the news talk about imminent nuclear war, just to cut to commercial about how life-saving surgeries have been completely corporatized, with artificial hearts coming in new sports models by Yamaha. Kids are being sold board games about bombing rival nations, all to cut back to a brain-numbingly unfunny sitcom, which every person in this version of Detroit finds hilarious.
I'd buy that for $1.
But ultimately what makes RoboCop such a phenomenal movie is the fact that even though it is riddled with satire and social commentary, and the views that its writers and director share are laid bare, RoboCop never comes across as preachy. The world depicted here is a nightmare to be sure, but we should never forget that we have a resurrected hero to root for. And the villains in this movie, especially the absolutely amazing Clarence Boddicker, played by veteran actor Kurtwood Smith, his performance is perfect. Seriously, even years later when I'd be watching that 70s show, I would always take Red Foreman's threats with a little bit more seriousness just because I had seen this movie back in the day. Today, when movies and television shows are being made, there always seems to be this desire to ground the bad guys to some level of reality and usually give them sympathetic backstories in order to humanize these evildoers. And while I do understand that that need is more realistic and it does make for more likable villains, Clarence Boddicker, he is just an absolute demon. A seriously bad dude for bad dude's sake. And when he finally does get got, you can't help but cheer. And the corporate scum at the center of all of this, we hate them just as much. They are vile, they are cutthroat, they have inflated senses of self that are obviously drug-fueled, and when they start killing each other off or RoboCop is forced into confrontation with them, again we can't help but cheer because we just love to hate these guys. And really, Verhoeven and the writers, they nail this vibe and they ride this line between satire and entertainment. Say something critical about the society producing it, but that stuff kind of exists mostly in the background and little cutaways, because the filmmakers here, they never forget that at its core, this is a big dick action movie, complete with tons of squibs going off, people repeatedly being thrown through glass windows, RoboCop busting through walls, and giant robots falling down flights of stairs. This writing of the line is so expertly done that I've literally had coworkers hit me with the, "What do you mean? RoboCop is not a political movie," after I've likened certain things that I've seen in the news to this particular hellish landscape here in RoboCop. And I mean, like, it's not even just the people that I work with. I mean, one of my friends just sent me this truly moronic Reddit post. I'm sure that this guy also thinks that the humans in Avatar were the good guys. Given RoboCop's initial critical and box office success, it was only natural that the demand for more was sure to follow. But whenever art and commerce meet, exploitation is the name of the game. Merchandise moves studios far more than critical acclaim, and if a property hits, you better believe that there are going to be sequels and other media tie-ins to capitalize. The first animated series came out shortly after the first movie was released, and even though RoboCop was R-rated as possible, even initially being given the rare NC-17 rating until MGM was forced to rein in some of the more sensational bits of hyperviolence, kids were being introduced to Murphy through a Saturday morning cartoon. A video game tie-in came shortly after, released by Data East on the NES, and it's about what you would expect given the state of licensed video games back then. RoboCop 2 came out in 1990, and while it definitely retained a lot of the original movie's biting critiques, the movie itself is kinda weird. It treads similar ground, and some of the character development that occurred in the first movie just seems to be forgotten. And although Irvin Kershner of Empire Strikes Back fame was brought on to direct the film, and the legend that is Frank Miller helped write the script, and a lot of the cast from the first film including Peter Weller reprised their roles to great effect, the overall tone of the movie is a little out there, at times feeling decidedly more comic booky than the first film. I'm not gonna say that it isn't without its charm, and I'm not gonna say that it doesn't have its die-hard fans, but the sequel, it feels far more like a cult classic when compared to the near masterpiece that is the first movie, and it does feel a little been there, done that when compared to the movie that came before it. But sadly, these two movies, if there was a golden age for Murphy, this was it. Things really only go down from here. 1993's RoboCop 3 capitulated to a larger audience considering that the franchise had previously been successful with younger children, and the film dropped the uber violence for a much more reserved PG-13 rating. Peter Weller dropped out for this movie, and just about the whole project, it's stupid as hell, it's not really clever, and it feels like it almost belongs to a completely different franchise, with a lot of scenes more or less feeling like they were included in the movie just in order to sell a brand new toy line than anything. Again, I'm sure RoboCop 3 has its fans, but in this case, I'm definitely not one. And after that, things continued rolling downhill. A 1994 television show lasted for exactly one season, same for a second animated series in 1998, and again, all this did was really muddy the waters for what RoboCop ever was in the first place. And then there was a 2001 miniseries, but despite its edgy vibe, it hardly moved the needle as well. And finally, in 2014, the original writers returned with Narcos executive producer and director Jose Padilla to reboot RoboCop to mostly mixed reception. I personally haven't seen it yet, so I'll hold my judgment, but again, it's a PG-13 action movie, and from everything that I've heard, the movie was good enough, but it could have really been its own thing, and wouldn't have really suffered if it was named something else entirely. On the video game front, things weren't much better. Of course, there were the 3 movie tie-in games, and while they are mostly inoffensive, they are just below average action titles for the NES and Super Nintendo consoles. And then there was the team-up game of RoboCop vs. Terminator on the Genesis, but again, it's kind of just licensed crap. I know people like it, but it's probably nostalgia speaking most of the time. And finally, there was a 2003 game just called RoboCop, developed by the now defunct Titus Interactive, but that game was so rough that the Swedish magazine Game Reactor called the Xbox version the worst video game since Superman 64, a notoriously awful licensed game released back in 1999, which coincidentally was also developed by Titus Interactive. So 1987 to 2024, damn near 40 years of RoboCop, and really all we truly have to show for it is the original tour de force, and then everything just got progressively shittier since. Of course, there was the cool RoboCop feature in MK11, but aside from being a fun bit of fan service in one of NetherRealm's weakest entries to date, it was just a fun curiosity more than anything. But there has recently been one blip of hope in the darkness, and it came from a truly unexpected place. And I am of course talking about the subject of today's video, Teon's RoboCop Rogue City. If you haven't heard of Teon, I'd hardly blame you. The Polish developer comes from humble beginnings. They formed in 2006 and made their start essentially producing shovelware for PC, the DS, and Wii platforms. But the first time I had ever heard of them was back in 2014, when they released the abysmal Rambo game. A rail shooter of sorts that just missed the mark completely. And as a result, it just didn't land. It was generic trash, very much in line with most of what Teon had been producing up until then, even earning Giant Bomb's worst game of the year for 2014.
It's like the controls don't feel good, right?
Everything about this sucks, Vinny!
Feels good.
But on the bright side, it did kind of start something of a trend for Teon. Whether it was through clever negotiation, or if it just says more about how often licensed games for movie tie-ins are often handed off to the lowest bidder, the Polish developer did find themselves in a unique position where they were able to obtain the licenses to some pretty big movie properties. Teon ended up releasing 2019's Terminator Resistance, and somehow the game came out alright to pretty good by most accounts. Sure, it was a little by the numbers, sure it wasn't going to win any awards, but in terms of just the vibes, it kind of seemed to serve the audience who came to check it out. People say it's a little generic to be sure, but it does let the player blast their way through T-800s in a way that felt authentic to the more recent Terminator flicks. I haven't ran through it myself yet, but this is how people who have played it have been talking about the game. And in November of 2023, the team released their most recent title, RoboCop Rogue City. And from everything that I had heard, people were saying that this game was surprisingly solid. So with that said, what is Rogue City? And more importantly, is it any good? And keep in mind, I'm going to talk freely about Rogue City from here on out, so there will be some potential spoilers. I don't plan on ruining everything, but I will talk about some of the major plot beats, so consider yourself warned if you are sensitive to that kind of thing. First things first, Rogue City, it basically treats the character of Murphy and the greater city of Detroit as if everything since RoboCop 2 never happened. So already, we're off to a pretty great start. And what's more, Peter fucking Weller is back to lend his voice and likeness to RoboCop for the first time since. I mean, he did come back for Mortal Kombat 11, but this is his first time really reprising the role in a feature-length project. So again, let's go. From a plot perspective, Rogue City basically treats itself like it is the true sequel to RoboCop 2. And considering what the '93 sequel did with the material, I'll say that all Teon and director Piotr Tosha, all they had to do was not fuck things up too bad, and everything would end up okay. And to be fair, they didn't fuck it up, but they definitely decided to play it safe to be sure, at least in some crucial ways. Delta City, OCP's planned rebuild of Detroit, it still hasn't been built, keeping the world of RoboCop in its consistent state of stasis, but at least the corporate stooges, they're still trying to make it happen. Murphy is still grappling with what it means to be a cyborg. Familiar faces like Ann Lewis and Sergeant Warren Reed are present and accounted for, and this is kind of strange considering Nancy Allen's younger likeness is being used, but she is being voiced by Kosha Engler, so there is a bit of a disconnect when she speaks, and it borders on fucked up with Reed because the actor who played him in the movies, Robert Doki, he passed away back in 2008. I'm sure the rights were signed off on, but much like Murphy, Teon really wanted to put this man back to work after his death as well. And, at least for me, it is kind of a weird vibe, but I do get what they're going for. But as far as the urban sprawl of Detroit goes, much like in RoboCop 2, the city is still a war zone. Rogue City starts off with a new game of punks called the Torchheads taking over the local news station in order to broadcast their demands to a new up-and-coming gang lord that has been moving in the shadows, a new kingpin known simply as the New Guy. Hostages are taken, RoboCop and Lewis are sent in, criminal scum get taken out. But similar to how Murphy would sometimes have visions of his life before being enslaved by OCP, Rogue City sometimes has sequences that are reminiscent of the Scarecrow sections of the Batman Arkham games, in which environments warp as Murphy's memories come flooding in. And at a pivotal moment in the hostage rescue, RoboCop basically malfunctions and is unable to act, almost costing a hostage their life until Lewis steps in. But this malfunction, it was captured by a local reporter and then broadcast to the greater Detroit area. And really, that is the setup for this game. New Kingpin, RoboCop is all wonky because of his human brain, and he has been assigned a shrink to help him understand his predicament. Stakes raise eventually when this continued wonkiness causes Robo to freeze and Lewis is seriously injured by this new guy character, a villain by the name of Wendell Antonowski, brother of Emil Antonowski. You know, one of the goons from the Boddicker gang in the first movie. The one who got the rawest of raw deals. But now his brother is on the scene trying to come up in the power vacuum left after the events of the first two films. And Lewis getting shot, this acts as an excuse to get Robo a new partner, a rookie cop named Ulysses Washington, who is an original character for this game. And then as the story pushes forward, there's an unraveling conspiracy about another OCP program called Afterlife that plays into the final moments of the story, but when painted with broad strokes, all of this is more or less the story setup for everything that plays out in Rogue City. When it comes to the story, it is serviceable enough, but in terms of how it keeps things bopping along and how it keeps Robo going from place to place, it's fine. I know I said that this game acts as if the events of RoboCop 3 never happened, and that's true, but it probably would have been better if I said that the events of RoboCop 3 haven't happened yet. Realistically, Rogue City is RoboCop 2.5, with enough little details pointing to this game taking place between the events of 2 and 3. So Teon, while they certainly had some creative freedom when it came to Rogue City, there is an overall feeling that the status quo must be preserved. Interesting things can happen, new characters can be added, and the plot can be massaged to fit a few retcons in here and there, but Teon was not allowed to completely change the direction of the series here. And so overall, the story, it's fine, maybe even good in some moments, but in terms of plot, I really don't think that's where the success of RoboCop storytelling and world building should be measured. Because more than anything, this experience is at its best when it is viewed as a collection of really cool moments, and really being given the opportunity to embody RoboCop. And really, Rogue City does a lot of this in some pretty interesting ways. When we are talking about the structure of Rogue City, this title has a lot in common with developer Starbreeze's earlier titles, like the Chronicles of Riddick, Escape from Butcher Bay, The Darkness, and Syndicate. And while the studio has since gone on to become the Payday company more than anything, key talent left to form the studio, Machine Games, which is best known for the most recent Wolfenstein titles.
Augenblick, warten Sie. Aus Frankfurt. Sind Sie Frankfurter?
Ja, ein Hotdog.
And Rogue City shares a lot of design philosophy with those titles as well. While there is always a linear progression through the game's narrative, there is always a kind of hub and spoke design found here. The story may start with the very straightforward assault on the besieged news station, but a subsequent visit to the Metro West police station gives way to plenty of side diversions. And while these tend to be fairly simple at first, like picking up a drunk criminal covered in vomit and taking them down to a holding cell, or getting involved in office bureaucracy by helping process complaints,
This line is open. Please form an orderly queue.
Officer, I have a problem. My neighbors are hostile toward me. I think it's because they're jealous of my new dog.
these quickly become far more involved in later areas, giving way to sublevels and optional storylines. And when it comes to the storytelling in this game and how it factors into RoboCop's characterization, these were easily some of my favorite moments. When you are watching a RoboCop movie, it makes sense to jump from scene to scene. keeping the tight pacing alive and well. Sure, there might be a small section about Murphy's humanity or a flash of RoboCop getting involved in some community service, but spend too long here and the audience might get twitchy, just waiting for the next big action set piece. But here in a game that can run around 20 hours if you are being a completionist, certain concepts have far more time to breathe. You always have your main goal of tracking down Antonovsky, but if you want to spend some extra time in each map before triggering the next big action sequence, you might spend quite some time in downtown Detroit writing up traffic tickets, going on a lengthy side mission to track down a killer when a murdered sex worker turns up in a back alley, or in some more comical sections, Murphy might break it down with some robot dance moves when talking to a kid who is a fan of Detroit's cyborg crime fighter.
Hey, Robo! Do the robot dance!
Watch and learn, young man.
You rock, Robo!
And really, it was in these quieter moments where I found myself completely digging what Rogue City was doing. With this game's hub and spoke structure, chapters always have a way of taking RoboCop back to the precinct when they've come to an end. And while this serves as a way of doling out side missions and plays into this game's upgrade structure, from a storytelling perspective, there is always a debriefing period as Murphy sits in during a calibration and psychological exam sequence. And these psych sections where Murphy is being asked to elaborate on his current situation while sat across from newcomer Dr. Olivia Blanche, the player is tasked with determining how Murphy is progressing. Has OCP's programming completely rewritten the man who was Alex Murphy, leaving RoboCop a cold husk and nothing more than a fascist corporate killing machine? Or is the ghost in the machine a real man who is rebelling against his current situation? We got glimpses of this sort of thing in the movies, but every time a new entry in the franchise came out, there was always sort of a soft reset in Alex's character. But again, here in Rogue City, we get to sit with this question much longer over our playtime. What is RoboCop? Who is RoboCop? And how does this character follow not only his prime directives, but also his remaining humanity? And with Murphy's prime directives in the first movie being shown to the viewer as serve the public trust, protect the innocent, uphold the law, and a fourth hidden one that essentially keeps him locked in as a tool to protect the same megacorp that created him. With these directives in mind, we kind of get to play around and make some choices about our playable cyborg. In optional sequences where Robo stumbles upon someone drinking in public, tossing garbage into the river, doing some hard loitering, or catches a youth tagging up an alley, the game always gives you a couple of options. Do you let these people off with a citation and hear them out when it comes to why they are doing what they are doing? Or do you interpret the law to its most literal interpretation and threaten violence before fining them immediately? And at least when it came to my playthrough and serving the public trust being the first prime directive, I always went with the former option. But if you want to play your RoboCop as a soulless piece of fascist tech, go get him, Tiger. Just remember while you're doing that ACAB not only applies to RoboCop, but also those assholes in the Paw Patrol as well. And for me, these moments were kind of the most fun that I had in Rogue City. Not since the slower moments of 2011's LA Noire have I played a game where I was hitting the streets on a normal beat that felt this normalized and almost mundane. And when juxtaposed against the hyper-violence of the action sequences here in Rogue City, these just came off as chill, funny, sometimes sentimental, but always they heightened this dynamic of Murphy the man versus Robo the cop. And also, these sequences are really where a shit ton of references and Easter eggs to the first two movies live more than anywhere else. So they prove to be pretty vibey while you lumber around slowly as RoboCop. And really, that is probably one of the worst parts of this experience and these quieter moments is RoboCop does move slow. There are some ways around it, but not enough. And then in these open world sections, there really isn't much in the way of music. So hearing Robo crunch around is kind of going to be the main soundtrack. But when the game eventually does get to the action, that is where the spirit of the movies is captured better than just about any other licensed game that I've ever played. In an era of detective vision and UIs that highlight everything to the player to the point where developers have stopped even trying to come up with clever justifications in world for their inclusion, we never need to worry about that with Murphy. Mission objectives can flash on the screen, environments can be scanned, and targets can be lit up because That's how it looked in the movie, and it always feels incredibly authentic, all while maximizing playability. And from the second that you fire Robo's signature Auto 9 pistol, you truly recognize the destructive power that comes with being in Murphy's metal prison. Seriously, the burst fire on this weapon just shreds criminal scum with the greatest of ease. And when coupled with the crunching footsteps and the sound of hydraulics that accompany your lumbering movement, it is hard not to feel like an apex predator in these early gunfights. And with Rogue City being a modern video game, of course there is an RPG progression system built into just about everything that you do here in Detroit. And that system goes even further into making Murphy an even more lethal protagonist. Seriously, everything in his kit is designed for full-on power fantasy, snatching up punks and then ragdolling them into walls, doing short command dashes to escape grenades, using a focus meter to dole out headshots with the greatest of ease, or slowing down time to target the exploding gas tanks of pursuing bikers. Just about every combat encounter here feels crunchy, grimy, and decidedly authentic to its source material. And then when the original RoboCop theme from the films kicks in when you're laying waste to these guys, it hits for sure. And then unlocking later game systems like the upgradable PCBs for your default weapon that allow for Call of Duty style perks to be activated with discoverable chipsets, these simultaneously bring a small amount of strategy to fine-tuning the stat allocations to your firepower, but can also be used to unlock insanely overpowered combinations of perks like never needing to reload your hand cannon while also letting the thing fire continuously in its full auto mode. And this gets even more ridiculous once perks for added gore are unlocked through the same system. And it's funny because in my last video I did on this channel, I critiqued how overpowered weapons in the Night Springs DLC for Alan Wake 2 effectively stripped away the survival horror aspect found in the main game, and how Jesse and Rose feeling like walking turrets kinda limited the fun that I had in that particular expansion. But here in Rogue City, just mowing down criminal scum as a stupid action hero in a stupid action game with stupid amounts of firepower that can be upgraded to ricochet off walls and neutralize just about any threat, it is kinda glorious. I guess it always comes down to the context. A game that once prioritized tension over everything else, suddenly leaning into an undercooked power fantasy, it hit one way. But an 80s action flick that reveled in its body count, letting you take the reins and partake in it to this degree, shit kinda slaps. And really that is where Rogue City is at its best. When you feel overpowered. When you are trudging through the streets and there's always this inherent threat of Murphy being able to cut down just about everyone, even when the situation may not call for it. But when things like fights with Ed 209s are shoehorned into the story and little nods to RoboCop 2's failed RoboCop replacements are thrown your way, I don't know. Things are fine, but the game doesn't pack the same punch once you've added a serious degree of sponginess to the shooting gallery. And these fights with the Ed 209s, they are kind of a highlight for another issue with Rogue City's design philosophy altogether. And if you are a regular to this channel, you might have already seen this coming, but it is the overall sense of hauntology that permeates a lot of this experience. Rogue City, like Five Nights at Freddy's Security Breach, or even Killer Frequency, other games that I've covered on this channel, Rogue City is slavish to its source material, almost to its detriment at times. The Ed 209s, of course, these are series mainstays. If you are making a RoboCop game, you gotta have an Ed 209. It's in the contract. When you are first introduced to the automated mech, Teon flirted with making things interesting as Robo and the Ed are placed into a competition of sorts, with OCP officials tallying up which one of the pair of mechanized crime fighters has the bigger body count. And here, things are kinda rad. You and this giant robot just Swiss cheese bad dudes all while you are optimizing your headshots. But when the mech inevitably glitches out in a sequence that is an almost one-to-one rewrite of one of RoboCop's most iconic scenes,
You now have 5 seconds to comply. 4,
I said
3,
everything is under control.
1.
Ed,
I am
stand
now
there.
authorized to use physical force.
and then that gives away to one of the least fun action sequences in this title.
What? Bro, what are you talking about, man?
And this choice to regurgitate other memorable sequences, sometimes while doing the bare minimum to remix them from the source material, it pops up more than a few times.
Bitches leave.
Just don't be late. Now, you leave. Bitches, come!
And while I get that these nods are here for fans, a group that I happily belong to, I did start to feel a bit, I don't know, what was once satire for the movies, it just started to feel kind of dry and routine.
Say the line, Bart! I didn't do it.
And really, between placing a mission in a very particular steel mill, the Ground Zero arcade, or even a convention center torn directly from RoboCop 2, again, it works, and seeing environments like the Metro West station rendered this faithfully are great bits of fan service and really lend to the authenticity, but it is kind of hard to get too excited by places that we've already seen while they are playing out lines of dialogue that we've already heard performed much better in a movie from nearly 40 years ago. And while everything that wasn't directly location scouted from the movies is padded out with generic Unreal Store assets, I don't know, it did kind of rob Rogue City of the opportunity to really develop its own identity. And it's really a shame because sequences in a VHS rental store, a prison during a full-blown riot, or an abandoned mall in particular, these sequences show that Teon knows how to bring their own unique environments to life. And the way that they lean into this gritty urban decay that really punches up the liminality of these spaces, I don't know, sometimes I felt like the fan service cut both ways. Rad for a second for sure, but every scene that was borrowed from the movies stole time from a potentially cool and unique environment that Teon could have made themselves. And even the characters that were developed for this game, like Blanche and your rookie cop partner Washington, or even the junkie turned informant who calls himself Pickles, all of these characters, they show that Teon has some pretty decent chops when it comes to building their own interpretation of the world that was already established in the movies. But aside from sometimes feeling a little been there, done that, Teon still has some work to do in terms of elevating themselves up to modern standards if they want to be a force within the industry. I played the PS5 version of Rogue City, and at least in my 20 or so hours of playtime, and again this is 9 months after the game was initially released, I ran into a few bugs and a few moments that really had some poor performance while making my way towards the end of this campaign. Decoupled audio.
In urban warfare. Thank you. Thank you. Now.
Weird glitches in music tracks. Almost all of the main villain's lines coming across as muted and muffled, slowdown and pop-in issues. What is otherwise a decent enough looking game that plays a notch above competent, a lot of the good craftsmanship here does feel compromised in some of the worst moments of this game's engine just white-knuckling the math that is being thrown at it. It should be stated though that in my personal experience, technical problems seem to show up at an exponential rate when this game had been running through an extended play session or after I had come back from placing the PS5 in rest mode. And I suspect that a lot of these technical problems were caused by a memory leak present in Rogue City's programming. Because once I started closing the application at the first sign of trouble, things started smoothing out.
I'm having trouble.
But considering the size of the team, the platforms this game is available for, and Teon's pedigree, I can say that all of this was far less annoying than it might initially sound. Rogue City is a competent action game most of the time, at moments feeling extremely solid when the game is firing on all of its cylinders, and it does a decent job of giving you more RoboCop to a degree that is a cut above almost everything that has been done with this character since the second movie. The spirit of the second movie is definitely captured here, and the spirit of the first movie is definitely acknowledged and referenced, all to a degree where this game just felt incredibly authentic. And I had a blast with it. So much so that I ended up picking up a copy for one of my close friends, and I recommend it to people who dig the source material. I don't know if this is a title that works so well on its own that you can go in without already liking the original movies, but if you like gritty action games with an enthusiastic amount of hyperviolence in them, you might dig it. And if you like games like The Darkness or Wolfenstein, then you might find yourself at home in the way that this game is structured, and the whole experience might just be right up your alley. For me, Rogue City is an interesting game. I liked it a lot. I loved the action sequences, some of the world building was incredible. I might even go as far as saying that, at least in my personal opinion, this game might be my second favorite thing to have come out of the RoboCop franchise, with obviously 1987's original film still standing firmly on top, but I do think this game comes in a cut above the second movie even. But because this game does have such a dedication to its source material, it is kind of hard for Rogue City to shed some of the identity crisis that Murphy has been continuously experiencing since the 1987 original. I plan on checking out Teon's Terminator game as a result of playing through Rogue City. And with the successes of this RoboCop title, I truly believe that there's a lot of potential coming out of this Polish developer. But now they are in a bit of a creative crossroads. They have already shown that they have the talent to make 2 solid 80s inspired licensed games, but they have also shown that they have some chops for writing their own twists on these properties that might serve as a good foundation for their own future IP. Only time will tell, and if they decide to strike out on their own, it's definitely a risk for sure. But seeing how lucrative selling nostalgia to an aging population of Gen Xers and Millennials continues to be, Teon might be firmly in a lane that works for them. I mean, NetherRealm has certainly been raking it in with the same mindset for years now. Who knows? But Teon is definitely on my radar now. And I'll keep an eye on what this studio does from here on out. Go get 'em, Teon, and long live RoboCop. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you for watching. It is always greatly appreciated. And if you liked the video, please consider dropping a like, comment, or hitting subscribe, as it greatly helps the channel. And if you are in the comments, let me know. What is your favorite licensed game of all time? Rogue City definitely nailed a lot of what it was going for, but I don't think it wears the crown for my personal favorite licensed game. But that will have to be the topic of another video. But with that said, on to the next upload. I hope to see you there, and until then, you are all beautiful people, and I hope you have a great day.